Okay, well, as you say, I was born in a fairly typical Jewish family. We attended Reform synagogue, and from the time I was probably 5 years old till 14 years old, I attended both Sunday and Saturday school. And of course, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, which is between Philadelphia and New York. So there was a large Jewish population, and there was a lot of information from New York and Philadelphia about Jewish activities. And I always recognized from the time I was very young, I always noticed that Jewish people didn't use slur words to condemn other people, like Black people, Puerto Ricans, or other people, whereas a lot of the Christian kids, some of whom were my friends, commonly use slurs. And that gave me a sense that maybe Jews are a little more or a little better than other people. Also, I was born in 1948, so I grew up, within a decade to 15 years after the Holocaust. And just about every Jewish family I knew had family members who had been killed in the Holocaust. And of course, in the 1950s, anti-Semitism was fairly common in the United States. Like, for example, Jews were not allowed to join non-Jewish country clubs. Jews were not welcome in a lot of places, and that's in the Northeast. Just imagine what it was like in the South and the Midwest of the United States. So I grew up. And another very important factor for me was when I was in elementary school, in public school, and let me point out that school prayer was not considered illegal until 1960, and I graduated from sixth grade in 1960. So up through sixth grade, we had to say the Lord's Prayer, which most people consider a Christian prayer, even though it comes from I believe, from Psalms in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. But what I really didn't like was my classes would have celebrations of Easter and Christmas, and which of course would not be allowed now. But they never had celebrations of Passover or any of the other Jewish holidays, Hanukkah, for example, which is not really a major Jewish holiday, but it coincided with Christmas. And so all that made me kind of maybe get the feeling that my society didn't really respect Jews very much. And so I grew up being very defensive about Jewish people and later on about Israel. And after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and took over the West Bank and Golan Heights, I was very proud of what Israel had accomplished. But I always knew, in fact, I didn't just know it, I felt it, that there would never be peace in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. And I didn't know why, but I used to hear that when I would be at synagogue as a kid. I used to hear the men talking about that a lot. And they would often say, well, the good news is that the Arabs never agree on anything. And so the Arabs are never united. Then, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser came along, and I think 1956, the leader of Egypt and the charismatic pan-Arab leader, and he became a threat. Now, David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of Israel, and Israel's first prime minister, and the leader of the Jewish Agency for many years before Israel's establishment in 1948, David Ben-Gurion referred to Nasser as the Hitler of the Middle East. And when you're a young kid and you have relatives who had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust, and you have relatives or friends of my parents who fought in World War II, when you hear that Nasser's the Hitler of the Middle East, just imagine what kind of images that conjures up in a young person's mind. Oh my God, the Arabs want to do to the Jews what the Nazis almost did to the Jews and partially did to the Jews. So all of that reinforced my attachment to my Jewish identity. And then years go by, and I was always defensive when people would say something negative about Israel. I would get upset, and I would deny that what they were saying was true. I would say it was Arab or Palestinian propaganda, and I had no basis for any of that, really. Then in probably the mid-90s, my identical twin brother, who's an Orthodox Jew and very, very, very anti-Palestinian, My guess is that he's a supporter of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, the two ultra-Orthodox ministers in the Netanyahu cabinet. My twin brother gave me a book that I had never heard of, but it was a bestseller called From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters. And that book allegedly proved that Israel has always been in the right. It basically said there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. Arabs from various parts of the Middle East moved to Palestine, to Israel, in order to get higher paying jobs from kind Jewish landholders. And they're never, and I can't remember everything it said, but it turned out it was all garbage. And it was completely debunked, first of all, by Norman Finkelstein in the United States, but it was also debunked completely by Zionist Jewish historians in the state of Israel. They referred to it as trash, utter propaganda, worthless. But I believed it all because it became my Bible. I believed it because it gave me an argument to refute anything that anyone said that was critical of Israel. So in 2006, as some people may remember, Hezbollah conducted a cross-border raid into Israel and killed 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2. This was in July 2006. I was very upset about that because 3 weeks earlier, Hamas had captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border. And I saw those 2 events as proof of an Arab world conspiracy to destroy the Jewish state. It became clear to me that the Arab world would not rest until they threw the Jews into the sea. I was convinced about that. And the day after Hezbollah's raid, Israel invaded Lebanon with immense force. And I was very upset, but I supported the invasion. I thought it was necessary. So a couple days go by, and I decided I was going to speak with 2 of my wisest friends, both of whom were not Jewish, and both of whom had been somewhat critical of Israel in the past. But this time I thought they would realize the severity of the situation, and they would realize that Israel really was only defending itself against anti-Semites. So I went to each of them individually, and I talked to them, and both of them blamed Israel for its disproportionate use of force against the people of Lebanon, and neither of them accepted my argument. And I was devastated. And so I went home and I thought about it, and I went over each conversation trying to see, did I miss something? Did I misunderstand something? And my conclusion was, no, I didn't miss anything. No, I didn't misunderstand anything. And only Jews can understand the suffering of our people. Maybe my dear friends, 2 of the most compassionate people I've ever met, maybe they're anti-Semites like all the other non-Jews, or most of the other non-Jews. So then a few days later, during this onslaught that Israel is conducting in Lebanon, I received a phone call, a rare phone call from a friend of mine in New Jersey who I grew up with. And he rarely calls. And I knew he had studied the subject of Israel and Palestine for many years, but he never made a big deal about it at all. He was very quiet about it. And he was fairly quiet by nature anyway. Anyway, he called to tell me that he was going to be coming out west, where I was living in New Mexico at the time, and was going to visit me. And I said, that's great. And then, by the way, the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews. And I went into a 2-hour diatribe against the Arab world, and he let me go. He rarely interrupted me, and he listened to me, and it was really over 2 hours. Occasionally, he would interject a comment like, "No, that's wrong," no, this is what's happening. But he rarely said anything, and he didn't argue with me. He didn't criticize me. At a certain point, he said, "Why don't you read books by these 2 Israeli professors, Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt, both of whom were very respected, though I had never heard of them." And I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe I should read something. Maybe there's something I don't know. The only book I'd read was Joan Peters' Trash. And yet I thought, like most of my Jewish friends today and most of Israel's supporters today, I thought I knew all there was to know. But because he gave me the space to question myself, after we hung up, I went online to Amazon and looked up books by Kimmerling and Reinhardt. And when you do that, you see other books on the same subjects. And I decided I'll go to my library and see if I can find some of these books. My stipulation was I only wrote down the names of books and the names of authors who were Jewish. I wasn't going to trust that a non-Jewish author could be honest or not anti-Semitic. This is how radical I was. So I went to the library, got a few books, came home. The next day I started reading, and maybe about a week after reading fairly uninteresting material that didn't really address my concerns that much, I started reading Norman Finkelstein's Beyond Chutzpah on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. I had never heard of Finkelstein. My friend who had directed me to Kimmerling and Reinhardt had years earlier had said that Joan Peters' book was debunked by a Jewish professor who lived in New York, but he couldn't remember the name. And he was referring to Finkelstein. And I just said, oh, well, that I don't believe that. The Jewish professor must have been confused, or maybe he's a self-hating Jew. So I started reading Finkelstein's book, and what happened was everything. I knew immediately that he was a brilliant man, and everything he said, his criticism was only directed towards Israel. There was no criticism of the Palestinian people at all, or the Arab side. And I was wondering, well, when's he going to speak out about the Arabs? But I couldn't put the book down because, number one, I'd committed myself to really studying the history as objectively as I could. And number two, I recognized in the first paragraph of the book that he was a brilliant man. Somehow I recognized that. So I kept reading. Plus, he documented all of his claims very meticulously. So his sources were organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. And so I was reading and reading and reading. And as I was reading, I would go look online for the sources that he was citing in his book. So I'd go to the papers that Amnesty International, for example, that they had written on the subject. And I would look for the quotes he had taken from them. I was hoping that I would find him taking the quotes out of context or changing a word here or there to misrepresent what the organization was saying. Unfortunately, sort of, at least from that prior point of view, everything he said was impeccable. There was nothing that he was beyond reproach. So I continued reading, and at a certain point, I was so absorbed in what I was reading that I allowed all the emotions that were going through me. I didn't resist at all. So I was going through shock at what I was reading. Oh my God, I've supported Israel all these years. This is what Israel's doing. Oh my God. And then anger at Israel for misguiding me all my life and getting me to support the maltreatment of Palestinians. Then my anger turned in on itself, and I got angry at me for being such a dupe and being so ignorant and never checking anything out. And then shame and embarrassment arose. And then finally, a great sorrow for the Palestinian people for all that they had been through. Well, first of all, I want to mention that I agree with Noam Chomsky that this propaganda stands on thin ground. That's one of the reasons why people become so hysterical when they're confronted with the facts, because they know they actually don't admit it. Most people I've met, they don't admit that they've never studied the history, but deep down they know they haven't studied the history. So when you confront them with a revision and a alteration of what they believe that proves that what they believe was completely wrong, they can actually become hysterical. It is a threat to their mortal identity. So you mentioned the Barak peace proposal, which refers to the 2000 Camp David summit at the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And yes, that is one of the most egregious propaganda beliefs that has infiltrated our society and the collective mind of Jewish culture, because they believe that Ehud Barak made a generous offer to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians rejected it, and they rejected it because they always reject peace, because they've rejected every other peace proposal prior to the year 2000, the Camp David summit. Well, first of all, Israel has rejected or ignored every peace proposal since 1948, since its establishment, every single one. And the 2000 Camp David is an example. So the head of Ehud Barak's negotiating team was Shlomo Ben Ami. And Shlomo Ben Ami, at the end of the failed summit, said, of the concessions offered by Israel fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations. A couple years after that, he said, if I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. Ned Walker, who was a former ambassador to Israel, who was part of the Clinton negotiating team, said, of the ideas discussed at Camp David, there is no way the Palestinians could have accepted this thing. And Gamel Halal, who was the Egyptian-American translator for the American team, who had worked for numerous presidential administrations, said, the whole point of the summit was for Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to get together and discuss making a peace agreement. But Ehud Barak locked himself up in his room and refused to meet with Arafat except for one time, but for tea only, and on the condition that they discuss nothing of substance. And so this is the reality. And then when you look further into it, Dennis Ross, who was the head of the American negotiating team, who the Israelis said was more pro-Israeli than they were, and who I read Bill Clinton had to shut him in his room and keep him away for a while because he was so pro-Israeli. Dennis Ross, years later in his book, I can't remember the name of the book, he said that the Israeli offer was 91% of the West Bank with a 1% land swap. But the Israelis did not present a map to the Palestinians. But then when you dig deeper into that 91%, Dennis Ross did not subtract out from the 91% the buffer zones that could be 5,000 meters in width, parks, all kinds of Jewish-only roads. And according to Ron Pundak, who was the head of the Shimon Peres Center, who died a number of years ago, who was part of the Israel Oslo team, he said that the Barak offer basically came down to about an offer of 60% of the West Bank for peace, which at that time the Palestinians just could not have accepted. And it did not include a capital in Jerusalem, which would have enraged the entire Arab world. So it was impossible for the Palestinians to accept such a worthless proposal. I believe Barak was there mainly to con Arafat into signing an end of conflict agreement, and that would absolve Israel of its responsibilities under international law. So that's one example. Do you want me to give you another historical example of this propaganda?
Yeah, maybe like one more if you like.
Okay, one more. One that is very common also is the 1947 UN partition plan. I often hear the Jewish side say, well, the Jews accepted partition and the Palestinians rejected it. So there. What they're saying is the Jews accepted partition, therefore it's the Palestinians' fault there's never been peace, and it's the Palestinians' fault they are under occupation. What they don't say is that the partition plan gave 56% of historic Palestine, along with 80% of the coast and the most fertile land to the Jewish side, 43% to the Palestinian side, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the remaining 1%, under the United Nations administration. And they don't say that within a week, Israel violated partition by moving institutions and the rabbinate, the chief rabbinate, into Jerusalem. They don't say that Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun and future prime minister, was praying that the Arab side, that the Palestinians would reject partition, because he knew that if they accepted partition, it would be much harder for Israel to make the cause to justify its expansion into the whole of Palestine. Because for at least 10 years before partition, it was clear to everybody, to the US State Department, to the Arab world, to all the Jews in Israel, that David Ben-Gurion, and the Jewish leadership had no intention whatsoever of honoring partition. As Chaim Weizmann said, one of the most famous of the Jewish leaders, the first president of Israel, as Chaim Weizmann said, we would be fools not to accept a state the size of a tablecloth, because once we get a piece of land that is legally ours, at least according to the United Nations, that will serve as the stepping stone to expand into the whole of Palestine, which Ben-Gurion repeatedly said. He promised his political party, that the partition plan was not the end of the issue. And also, a Jewish state under partition would have had, depending on who you read, between a 40 and 49% Arab or Palestinian minority. And with the higher birth rate, eventually, within a few years, the Arab minority would have become a majority. So it's ridiculous to believe that Israel would have accepted such a thing. And so these people now, today, who are blaming the Palestinians for not accepting the theft of their land, just some institution taking away their land because they were badgered and blackmailed and treated badly by the Jewish side, to think that the Palestinians made a grievous error by not accepting partition is really ridiculous, especially in light of the fact that Israel isn't even satisfied with the 78% of Palestine it's controlled since 1949. So why would it be satisfied with only 56% without Jerusalem? It's another illogical, ridiculous argument that they make, but they can't come up with any real arguments because there aren't any. There really aren't any.